All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started, everybody. It's nice to see you here. Thank you for joining us during your lunch hour. My name is Lesley Bartlett. I'm chair of the Department of Educational Policy Studies, and it is an incredible pleasure to welcome home Dr. Kirk Anderson. His work focuses on equity and justice in higher education. He graduated with his doctorate in Ed Policy Studies in 2018. So he was noting for us right as the undergrad major was taking off, which made it a very different department at that time. He conducted an ethnography of diversity, policy, and practice at a large public university. And during the course of the pandemic, he began exploring the intersections of critical and contemplative pedagogies in college classrooms. Kirk is currently conducting a critical participatory action research project with a team of Dickinson College students to investigate how trauma-informed pedagogy can be theorized and practiced in a justice and student-centric way. So there's lots for us to talk with him about. He's going to give a brief overview of some themes of his work, and then we have lots of time for question and answer. So please do be thinking about what you might like, what questions you might like to pose. He's generously offered to field lots of questions. Welcome, Kirk. We're so glad you're here with us.
Thanks, Lesley. It's so good to be here. And thanks for coming out. This is just really fun for me. I am so indebted to EPS and the people involved in EPS in so many different ways, for who I am as a teacher and as a scholar and even just as a person. So I thought when John and I were talking about doing this, the hope was to just make it conversational so that hopefully this feels like a meaningful time for you. And so I thought I would just give a little bit of an overview of myself and my sort of professional trajectory. It has been a long and winding road to get to where I am today, and even a lot of zigging and zagging in terms of my research interests and what I ended up doing. So I'm originally from Austin, Texas. And so even my route into education was a bit strange, where I sort of fell into a job in educational publishing right out of undergraduate. I got a job because I was working at a used bookstore and ran into my high school or middle school social studies teacher who remembered and liked me and connected me with her best friend. And that was my first job. And so as I'm like coaching seniors right now and they're panicking about, not having, six-figure salaries lined up, their friends in business. And I'm like, it's okay. I worked at a used bookstore. You'll be fine. And so I fell in love with education, but realized I really hated working in publishing, particularly for this company. And so one of my oldest friends at the time had just started a Ph.D. at Michigan State. And when he talked to me about what he was doing, this is really fascinating, and maybe education is a bit more expansive than I originally thought. And so applied all over the place. I actually originally thought I was going to do a sociology graduate program, and I tell my students this too. I completely bombed my first round of graduate applications because no one in my family had done that. No one explained to me how it worked, and I put together pretty terrible and uncompelling applications and was rejected from everywhere. And so I finally sort of got some coaching from people who knew what to do, and thought I was actually going to go to Michigan State too, and then visited Madison with my partner. This would have been, I think, sort of early 2011, and fell in love with the department and the program. I have to give a shout out to a lot of people, but most notably Nancy Kendall, who was my advisor, who is amazing, and I continue to be indebted to. And so started EPS in 2011, and I still vividly remember the new graduate student, is that EPS 700, the one that would meet for 3 hours? They used to do it at from 7 to 10 at night, which felt a little bit brutal at the time. We would all begin to pass out by about 9. And I remember most vividly how we would go around the circle and, introduce ourselves to, whoever happened to be visiting, Adam or Michael Apple or, Tom, whoever was there that day. And everybody had these really sophisticated descriptions of what they wanted to study. I'd be sitting next to my friend Amy, who'd be like, I'm really interested in women's education, particularly around entrepreneurship and Francophone, West Africa. And I'd be like, don't really know, maybe something related to development. I'm not sure. And I just remember how painful it felt that everybody had these like sophisticated ideas of what they were going to study. And I just felt completely clueless. So I graduated on the CIE track, but actually as a result of some projects I did. First, I did my master's thesis on the experiences of international graduate students and how their families were involved in the process of going abroad, and then doing a project in a class with Rochelle Winkle-Wagner over in ELPA, looking at Indigenous students and particularly their involvement in Indigenous student spaces. Got really interested in issues of diversity in higher education, and in particular sort of thinking about diversity as something that institutions do, not as something that people are, and trying to examine what diversity means in terms of like a field of practice. And so one of the really just amazing things about working with Nancy and with other faculty in the department is each time my ideas would evolve or a new question would come up, I was always encouraged to pursue it. And so it took a few years for me to figure out what I was interested in, the kinds of questions I wanted to pose. And the department, I think, just did an amazing job making space for me to do that. And in addition, so sort of figuring out my area of interest, I came in, my undergraduate degree was in English literature. I didn't know what ethnography was when I started graduate school, and now I'm an ethnographer in large part thanks to all the wonderful ethnographers and anthropologists I worked with at Wisconsin. And then I realized through some of the classes I was taking that I was really interested in social theory too. And so the department and my committee made a lot of space, particularly in my prelims and elsewhere, for me to kind of dig deep and to study social theory. And so those three things kind of converged into this ethnography I conducted. And then kind of fast forward my senior year, when I met a few of you in those social theory seminar classes. I think, like most people at the time, I was just sending out applications to any and every vaguely, remotely relevant, faculty position in foundations, policy studies, curriculum and instruction, those kinds of things. And it was a nail biter for me. I was at ARA in April, got a call from Dickinson College about a visiting professor position, and then flew out there and was offered the job, I think 2 or 3 days before I got my hood and graduated. And so for me, it was right down to the wire, and like not really knowing what I was going to be doing after I graduated. And then so that summer, my family, we moved out to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which I had never heard of prior to moving out here. So we're a little town in the center of Pennsylvania. We're near Harrisburg, the capital. We're most famous, or probably more likely infamous, for the Carlisle Industrial Indian Boarding School. And so a lot of the sort of educational history around here is around sort of white supremacy and colonialism, and Dickinson's an interesting place that's kind of wrestling with that history. So came out for a visiting assistant professor position, and fell in love with the place. So I did my undergraduate at Texas A&M University, which I think is still one of the biggest universities in the country. It was 40,000 undergrads when I was there. I think it's about 60 now. Dickinson, in contrast, has 2,400 undergraduates. And so I had no context for private higher education, for small liberal arts colleges or anything like that. And I fell in love with the place. So I work in a small department. There's only 3 of us. So it's educational studies. It's very much the sort of undergraduate liberal arts version of EPS. Yeah, when I was at Wisconsin, the undergraduate major didn't exist. So it was really fun. I had spent a lot of time teaching EPS 300, School and Society. I don't know if that class still exists in the same form today, but really loved teaching a class that was kind of an introduction to, oh, it does still exist. That class made me. I teach a version of that class here called curriculum theory that is very much, it has a lot of EPS 300 DNA in it. And I love classes like that, where it's kind of an introduction to educational systems and inequities. And so I fell in love with this department, in part because I get to teach a little bit of everything, because there's only 3 of us, and our office is a little house on campus. And it was interesting moving into this space. So Dickinson is what's called like a moderately selective liberal arts college. So we're not like we're not trying to compete and draw students away from Ivy League schools, but we get this interesting mix of students where on one hand, some of my students, like I had a student who went to the same boarding school as Catherine Zeta-Jones's kids. And then we have other students who are particularly in a lot of the social studies programs or social science programs like ours, who are the, first gen. We have a lot of BIPOC students. I have a lot of students who come in are actually like students who through like a special scholarship program went to some of these selective private and boarding schools. And so it's this very different eclectic mix of undergraduate students sort of across the, the social class range and from all sorts of different identities who are converging in this space. And so it's a very different student population than what I taught at Wisconsin. So I fell in love with this place, found out that I was covering for someone who was in the process of retiring. And I was like, okay, there's a tenure track line opening up, went through the whole process, felt really good. And they passed me over for another candidate. And so I spent a semester not really sure what I was going to do, was applying for positions all over the place. And it actually looked like I was maybe going to move out to Idaho. And then at the last minute, the candidate pulled out and went to a different school. And so they came back and offered me the position. And so I stayed. And so I started the tenure track, and within, a little over half of a year, COVID hit. And so I think I still don't know what a normal year looks like as a tenure track faculty member because of we were remote. And then I think we are still sort of dealing with the fallout of the pandemic, and especially being at a tuition dependent school that's all about undergraduate education. The higher ed sector is obviously experiencing a lot of crises, but I think liberal arts is experiencing a unique form of that. But it's been a really wonderful place. I have two really supportive colleagues, and despite the kind of politics that I now realize exist at every kind of institution, I've been able to be a part of a lot of really cool initiatives and kind of carve out a space of collaborators and colleagues and friends across the college. But the big development or change that happened was in my research. So, I'd planned to like really quickly sit down and try to turn the dissertation into the book. And then like the world blew up. We had our son was a toddler at the time. He was home. Both of us were trying to work. At the time, my partner was a therapist in the campus wellness center. So we were both trying to keep students alive over Zoom and also manage a pretty feral toddler throughout the course of the pandemic. And so I was asked to join this committee that was trying to figure out, like, what do we do in the pandemic? So, we were realizing that we were ill-equipped in pretty much every way to deal with what we were seeing. And so I got asked to put together a training on trauma-informed pedagogy that I developed with my partner, who's a social worker and uses trauma-informed care in her work. And we got such a strong response from that work that I got curious about like what the literature was and who was sort of writing about this stuff in higher education, only to discover that there was very little, especially in terms of empirical work. And so that sort of summer of putting together these professional development opportunities opened up this unique opportunity where on one hand, my partner and I do trainings and workshops on this stuff for colleges and universities and professional organizations. But then our college offers some pretty cool programs where you get money to hire undergraduate researchers, because especially at a liberal arts school, they want undergraduates to get involved in research. And so that the summer of 2021, I had two students who I got to know pretty well who stayed with me in Carlisle for the summer, and we spent the summer diving into the literature and analyzing it. And it was this really transformative experience because I was very much the lone ethnographer as a graduate student. It was just me doing my fieldwork on my own, certainly, bouncing ideas off of friends and faculty in my committee, but doing my own thing. I never worked on a team before like this. And so I had these two brilliant undergraduate students who, I was training them on how to read and analyze literature. And, we're working our way through this stuff. And we were sitting around one day, and my student was like, or one of them said, Kirk, we're like reading all the stuff about trauma-informed pedagogy and how it's supposed to be about empowerment and collaboration and rethinking the relationship between students and teachers. Why has nobody bothered to ask students what they think of any of this stuff? And it was a light bulb moment. So I was like, oh, we're assuming that like if the professor says, they know what it means to create a trusting or safe classroom, they're assuming that they know what those things mean for students. And so that formed the basis of this participatory action project that we've been working on for the last 2 years. So I've had this team of undergraduate students who we like from the ground up designed a study together. So we trained in methods together, and then we've been conducting focus group with students to talk with them about what things like safety and trustworthiness and empowerment means to them. And it's been this amazing experience because not only have we gotten to present at conferences, we're actually going to present at AERA next week. Those first 2 original students I worked with, we just had a manuscript accepted to the Journal of Trauma Studies in Education. But it's been this really amazing way, I think, to challenge some of my like professor blinders that I sometimes get, where I only view the world from my own sort of egocentric perspective, and they're constantly helping me think about both methodologically and theoretically and analytically about things from a student's perspective. And it's just been this really fun, exciting, engaging, hectic, and at times stressful project. But we're actually looking next year, I get a pre-tenure sabbatical, and we're actually going to try to expand the project to some other peer institutions and to kind of keep this going over the next few years at least. And so that's my professional journey in a nutshell. But I just want to frame this all by saying I really did like meander. I was not the kind of student who came in with a clear plan or knew what I was doing. I'm still not sure if I know what I'm doing. 5 years in, I still kind of feel like a graduate student who somehow snuck into a faculty position, and one of these days they're gonna find me out. But my hope is that like this conversation can be helpful for you, not because I'm any example or exemplar, but just to give you a sense of what it can look like on this side of things. So I'm excited about our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson. That was very insightful. And if anyone has any questions, you can either unmute yourself or feel free to post them in the chat. Also, I totally empathize with that feeling of like that imposter syndrome of like, but it's like we all belong in the places we are currently at, and better places.
And please, to everyone, I'll tell you what I tell my students here. Please just call me Kirk. I'm not so far removed that from my graduate studies that I don't get a little ego bump when someone calls me Professor or Dr. Anderson, but Kirk is just fine.
Lesley's asking the first question. I have what may sound like an odd question. I wonder whether, and if so, how your ideas about research have shifted in moving to a new institution.
Yeah, I love that question, Lesley. Thank you. I think it's impacted me as as both an instructor and a researcher. And I actually, so at Dickinson, the kind of pre-tenure timeline is that they do a full review and observation at 2, 4, and 6 years. And so I just completed my 4th year review. And so you have to write these lengthy statements about your identity as a teacher and a scholar and your service work. And so it's a good opportunity for me to try to connect the dots and think about, okay, so I've done all these different things. I teach a really eclectic set of classes. I've had these shifts in my research. What are the through lines? And I think one of them, if not the most pivotal one, is sort of thinking about and trying to theorize institutions and the ways in which subtle, I'm going to go on a little tangent here. So, I so identify as like as an anthropologist of educational policy. That was the training I got from amazing faculty in this program, and I'm like, I now like teach in my policy seminar those classic pieces like policy is practice, right? And so thinking about all of the ways in which policies and practices are the sites or the spaces in which educational outcomes are created, or like to kind of borrow the language of like Angela Valenzuela, like people don't fail at schools, schools fail students, right? And so thinking through the different ways in which the culture of institutions, the subtle and taken for granted kinds of practices that are all around us that kind of fade into our background actually play a pretty powerful role in shaping people's daily experiences as they move through those institutions. And so it was a really interesting reset to go from Wisconsin, where, you know, certainly when I was there, it was when, and it's so nice to say this, the former Governor Scott Walker was in power, and like we were, you know, like we were marching up State Street what felt like every other day, and you know, there was just all these tense politics, and you know, certainly like the death of Tony Robinson, and there was just like so much happening where we were battling with not just powers in Madison, but statewide powers and all these different things. And then I moved to Dickinson. That's this like small, you know, small school in a small place. We don't have a faculty senate because the entire faculty meets once a week, all 200 plus of us, with the provost and the president. And there's the sense of like, oh, we're all so small and it's so collegial, and like we're not a hierarchical institution. We're all just buds, and you know, and at first, like, I think I was a little bit seduced by that, and like, oh yeah, this is such a different space, and we don't have some of those same political problems. And then, you know, the longer I stayed here and participated in faculty and campus politics, and you know, worked with student activists and protesters and those kinds of things, I think I began to develop a little bit more of a nuanced lens in terms of how the kinds of things I saw played at Wisconsin and at my field site, my unnamed large public flagship institution, are that there are certain pieces of that I think that are omnipresent, but that they also vary in smaller institutions like this. And so I think it took me a little while to kind of snap back to the kinds of lenses the lens I had developed as a dissertator doing that project. And so in some ways, I think it's the larger, that sort of anthropology of that policy lens is still there, but I've had to kind of refine it a little bit to think about how these kinds of things play out in smaller institutions that don't have the veneer of hierarchy, but that I think very much still operate according to, you know, to the workings of power and the ways in which even, you know, sort of subtle things can work to have pretty big impacts on people's experiences here. And so, yeah, it's really like opened up a whole new avenue, and especially having to do work now that's specifically grounded in the experiences of an undergraduate research institution has certainly required me to kind of dial in, and especially because like it's just a totally different scene. Like I still kind of can't wrap my head around what it's like to be one of 2,400 students, and just how much that can change your experience versus being, you know, one of 40,000. But yeah, it's I'll say this maybe a million times today. I'm so deeply like grateful for my methodological training as an ethnographer, because in some ways, like, that's the mode I jumped into when I came here, where it's like, all right, time to start tracing relationships. Let's set up some informal interviews with people, you know, like I think that definitely guided the way I kind of tried to find my footing here. Rob.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I would just love to hear about your experiences shifting from more of, I don't know, ethnographer of institutions to doing participatory action research as well. Like, so, like, what has that your learning experience been like for adapting a different form of methodology, or yeah, different methodology, but still studying institutions?
Yeah, it was. It's been a fun challenge. I mean, I think what's made it really exciting is that I'm learning it with the students. And so in some ways, that I think that took the pressure off to feel like I had this full expertise. And I think, like, in some ways it was this gift, because it forced me to cede expertise to the team and not just come in and be like, I'm the experienced researcher, you need to listen to me, and being more open to the really brilliant insights they've had at every step of the process. I mean, I think, you know, I'm certainly like deeply experienced in conducting interviews, and so I think some of that transfers over well, but I'd never conducted focus groups. And like just right now, like, we are in the process of analyzing our data. I'm trying to teach my students how to use Deduce, the qualitative software. And so, you know, we're still in the process of kind of learning as we go. But I think it's been a real joy to figure out that stuff with and alongside students, because they're really wonderful. I really enjoy all of these students, because you know, we, like, as we're trying to figure out like how to engage and recruit participants, I'd have all these ideas and they would just look at me and be like, Kirk, that's a dumb idea. Like, stop sending emails. Nobody is going to read your emails. We need to set up an Instagram account. I was like, fine, y'all can do that, right? You know, do a collaboration with whatever weird like, social media accounts your friends are running. And so, yeah, and I think, like, part of the students I recruited to my team, in part, what I think, made me excited to work with them was what they were also raising these things. And so, like, I think about one of my students, Wesley. I teach this piece about trauma-informed pedagogy in my curriculum theory class, the one that's like EPS 300. And, we were talking through sort of what this stuff looks like in practice. And she was like, Kirk, this is great, but what does it mean if someone like leaves the classroom and the whole institution is traumatizing? And I was like, that's a really brilliant insight. Would you like to join my team? Right. And so I think it's been really cool because they also know those things. And so and part of what's been fun about doing this as a participatory action project where I'm working with students, doing the research, on students' experiences is like they also bring up these critiques, right? Like they, even if they're not, as nuanced or, there's things that maybe students don't totally understand about how the institution operates, they have really powerful, thoughtful, nuanced critiques about how the institution works and what it means for their experiences. And so in some ways, I think I'm fortunate in that like students go there anyway in our focus groups. And I call them my co-researchers. My co-researchers bring those things in as well. And so, I think like we're still kind of working through things, but the hope is always to, again, bring it back to this isn't just about setting another set of expectations on instructors at a time when I think we're constantly being asked to do more and be more, even as resources are declining and all those other things, but that it's also about what is the responsibility institutions have to make these kinds of practices flourish, right? Yeah. But again, I have to give like just an enormous amount of credit to these undergraduate researchers who are total rock stars.
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead of John. Sorry, John. I would love just to learn a little bit more about like the what you had to learn in order to like change your research process. I think like I have appreciated learning how to do more of like I don't know, ethnographic methods, but as you mentioned, a lot of grad school is intentionally like designed around independent projects. So what skills were you working on developing intentionally in order to be able to conduct like participatory action research? What suggestions might you have for folks that are interested in doing that work for, I don't know, how to be more comfortable being in those spaces or thinking about research in a different way?
Yeah, this makes me think of, I remember, so towards the end of my time at Wisconsin, I got to do a fellowship through the Center for Ethics in Education, which is a philosophy of ed outfit that tries to encourage philosophical work and brings together both social scientists and philosophers of education and philosophers. And I had so much fun doing it. And I came home one day and I was talking to my partner. I was like, man, I wish I could like start all over again and also get a PhD in philosophy. And she looked at me and she was like, don't think about that. Like get that idea out of your head, right? Because it had been close to 7 years at that point. And I was talking about it with Anthony Layden, a guy at Chicago who's part of the program. He was like, Kirk, like what we're training you to do is lifelong learning, right? Is that like we're going to give you the tools that way you can always explore and go down new directions. And so I think the kind of training I got, I did the like 3 sequence methods program in the School of Education, and then even in the process of going through the full cycle of a dissertation, I think gives you kind of a template for the in a sort of agnostic way to think about, training yourself in methods and then applying a project. So I think that's one level, and like trying to think through, okay, like what are the things that even though my training is specific and experiences in ethnography, what can I transfer? And then, I also had the additional benefit of we have an undergraduate research methods class that surveys the whole field of quantitative and qualitative methods in education, which gave me some more familiarity. And then for this particular project, like where we started was once we hired our full team of 5 students, I was like, all right, we need to go out and find sources on what it means to apply, critical, CPAR and focus groups. And so like as a team, we went out and found sources, and then we would read and annotate and discuss them. And we didn't, and like just like I learned from I always talk a lot in my methods class about like my master's thesis and my first interview protocol, which had like 17 questions, which was like you can't do in a single interview. And so instead, we spent all this time writing and drafting our focus group protocol, and then we piloted it and tested it and changed it. And so I think that just like being willing to recognize that like I didn't have the training, and just saying like, you do what you always do and you go back to the literature, right? And you learn about how other people do it. And, particularly around focus groups, there are we found great resources that were specifically like, this is how you should conduct focus groups with college students. And then we would read, 3 or 4 of these articles and come together and be like, okay, so this person says this is how big the group should be. This one says this. What do we think? What are we going to shoot for? And like, and so it really like it felt like kind of running a mini methods class where I was kind of a student teacher and everybody else was a student teacher too. And like, it's also worth noting that it was slow. Like we spent the whole semester training in methods and trying to figure out what we want to do. When you have 5 students who only work for you 8 hours a week, and I was really insistent, like you can't work more than I pay you because we pay garbage wages to our students anyway. It took a long time to get us up and running. And at each stage of the process, it's been a lot of learning before we've been able to do. Yeah. And then it also helps too. I mean, like, one of the joys of being at an institution like this is that like I'm close with colleagues across the school. And so like, it's an opportunity to kind of draw on other people's expertise. All right. I'm noticing there's a few questions. John, I see yours. It says, I wonder if you could talk a bit more in detail about your dissertation process, how you organize fieldwork, data analysis, writing, looking back, what worked well, what would you maybe do differently if you did it again? And actually, to kind of bridge the two, I always think about taking a seminar with Tom Popkowitz. I don't know, is he still in CNI? I thought there's been this like rash of retirements over there. Is he still?
I'm not sure. I think so.
I know Michael retired. But he would always say like novel questions require novel methods, which is to say like, don't be afraid of kind of going off script. And I think like that mantra really stuck with me because one of the things that I ran into was it kind of very similarly to this project where, there's just like not been a lot of empirical work on trauma-informed pedagogy in higher ed. I knew I wanted to do a higher education ethnography, and there's just honestly not that many of them. And as I spent time sort of going through the kind of the international body of ethnographic work, there weren't all that many full-length ethnographies that had been published. And I realized, and I actually have a piece about this in the International Journal of Qualitative Studies and Education. I realized, like, on one hand, there's all these like really cool theoretical pieces. It's a lot of like political economy and thinking about the commodification of higher education. And so it's really rich theoretically, but there's not a lot of ethnographic detail. And on the other end, there's these super cool ethnographies, but they're very niche. So it's like, we're going to follow this group of like women identified students in one party dorm, or we're going to look at the experiences of these 15 Muslim American college students. And so they're really neat, but what I realized was that the institution kind of receded from view. And so it was like the university was always the field site, but it really wasn't theorized ethnographically. It was more about the sort of like subculture, like there's another one that takes place in like an admissions office. And again, really cool studies, but I felt like this kind of institutional lens just didn't exist. Like I only found a couple pieces that kind of went in this direction. And so I had to ask myself, I'm like, well, so if I want to study the institution, how on earth do I do that? If I can't find that in my field in higher education, I've got to go elsewhere. And this is where like, Nancy Kendall was really helpful where, she helped me, like I went and looked at like hospital ethnographies and I looked at medical anthropology because one of the things that it was really, really important to me, and I knew I couldn't understand the phenomenon I wanted to study if I only worked with one group, because that was the model, right? You just work with a group of students. So you do something with faculty or you do something with staff or with administrators. And I was like, no, I need to understand how they engage together. I need to understand where they're connected and to kind of trace out these social networks because I knew I wasn't really going to understand sort of diversity as a practice without that. And so drawing on, medical anthropology, looking at the sociological literature, like, Smith's work on institutional ethnography and feminist ethnography, I just had to look elsewhere. And again, I think like this is where the like wonderfully eclectic training that you get in a program like EPS is so important. And even really too, like having studied a lot of international development literature, because I think there's some pretty fascinating parallels between how sort of development organizations work on, populations and communities in the global South and what higher education institutions do. I think a lot about Tanya Lee's idea of like the will to improve and the ways that we try to fix people through what we do. And so I realized that I was going to have to kind of cobble together my own template, but I did so trying to draw on what felt like really useful tools from other ethnographic and anthropological traditions. And so on one hand, it was really exciting because I felt like I was doing something kind of fun and novel. On the other hand, it was tricky, right? And so, I spent a while making connections at my field site and building relationships and, beginning to find those first few key informants. And certainly like the process of proposing the dissertation was a great time to kind of work out those ideas. But it's always a process of adaptation. So I began my field work in the fall of 2015. And I picked a field site because it was sort of recognized as a quote unquote, national leader on diversity. They had a new strategic plan that they were rolling out, and I wanted to sort of see this policy implementation in real time. So, I started this project, and 2 months in, these major protests start to pop off at Yale and Missouri, and then like higher ed blew up, right? Like hundreds of campuses, students are protesting, they're storming the streets, it's still wild to me looking back that like a D1 football team forced the resignation of a university president. Like things were wild. And so then all of a sudden, 2 months in, the story changed, right? I thought I was going to study all of these kind of mundane, taken for granted diversity practices. And I was, but I was doing that in the context of this campus where there were major student protests. And then there was this cycle at the time where like, there would be this like super high profile, really awful racist incident. Students would protest, the university would bungle its response, and then we would start the cycle all over again. To the point where like after a year and a half of doing field work, it was that like saturation point that you go for where you're like, I know exactly what this university president is going to say at the next press conference because I've heard them say it 5 times before, right? I know the rhetorical maneuvers. I know how they're going to try to sidestep this thing. I know what, demands they're going to, meet and which ones they're going to ignore. And so I ended up having to adapt in part because the context and the phenomenon that I was studying radically changed, but in a cool way, in that like I felt very fortunate that I was on the ground doing this work at that time. And so it required, I think, a lot of flexibility and adaptability just because I wasn't anticipating I was going to be studying a student protest movement. And I wasn't necessarily anticipating I was going to have to be, at this campus until late in the middle of the night, because that's when undergraduate students do things. They don't do it at like 7 in the morning when I'm awake and doing stuff. And so, throughout that whole thing, it's a process of working with your committee and in part, I think processing your experiences too, because I think, one of the things I realized that I was just really unprepared for was the kind of emotional toll that extended fieldwork can take, just because in a much more neutral way, it's just draining, right? My partner called it like researcher FOMO, where like I felt like I wanted to be there all the time, but I'm studying this big site and I can't be everywhere all the time. Learning to recognize that like just because you missed one thing one day, if you're in the field for a year and a half, you will catch other things. But also like the toll of kind of bearing witness to trauma and the things that I was seeing in April of that year. So, a little over halfway through my field work, like it all kind of caught up with me emotionally. And I realized like just how difficult it was to spend my days like hunting down institutional racism and seeing how people were being drained as a result of trying to fight those things. And so I think one of the things I would do differently is just build in more support to kind of process emotionally and not just kind of cognitively what I was experiencing. And so because I think in many ways just extended field work takes a toll. And I know so many students in our program are interested in issues of, equity and thinking sort of radically about educational problems, but that does come with a cost. And then, kind of quickly touching on analysis, I think it's been really fun to kind of reflect on this experience because I now talk a lot about it in my methods classes. But I know one of the things that was really challenging for me was that I came in I identify as a theorist. I love me some social theory. Rob and John can attest to this. I was and still am all about Antonio Gramsci and Ernesto Laclau and this sort of post-Marxist blending of sort of post-structuralist and Marxist critiques. And it was I had this way for thinking about sort of the political economy of education, I think in a way that could account for racialization. And I was so interested in this theory. And I really brought that to bear in a heavy way when I started my analysis. And Nancy Kendall was like, Kirk, you got to slow down. She's like, you're just going to go hunting for things that confirm your theoretical framework. You need to build in space to step back from that and to look at your data from some different vantage points. And I think that coaching and mentoring really helps because I think my theoretical framework still was really useful, but it helped me find things and notice things that I think I had blind spots for. And so for me personally, as someone who really loves and geeks out about theory, I needed someone to kind of help me say, you need to take a step back and try to consider this from some different vantage points. And I think the project was better for that. I see a question from Antonella. Can you speak about your experience making policy recommendations from ethnographic research? Oh my gosh. Okay. How do you see the connection between research and policy? That is a good question that gives me heart attacks every time at conferences. So a great example of this is this last year, I went to the NASPREC conference that was down in Baltimore. It's the Student Affairs conference, and it's a really interesting conference in that it's mostly folks who work in student affairs, although a lot of researchers and faculty members come too. And so it's this interesting mashup of kind of research and practice. And the people who come to these sessions, they really want to know. They're one person was like, I'm a chief diversity officer at my school. I want to know how I do things differently, right? And I think it's tricky to know how to make concrete policy recommendations from ethnography. And in my particular case, I think it was hard because so often I felt like what I was studying was everything going wrong. Right. And so it's not like I could point to, oh, here's best practice, right? And this was super effective because so much of what I was really at its core, what I was identifying was why it is that we spend so much human effort and so much money on something, but don't seem to actually make tangible, concrete changes towards racial justice and equity on campus. We seem to be stuck in these cycles, despite the fact that diversity is big business. And so I think going to conferences has really pushed me and challenged me to think through how to make those concrete recommendations. And so, for instance, at the NASPA conference, I was presenting on a paper where I was looking at folks who do student affairs diversity work. One of the people I interviewed described it as the institution burning through him, treating his trauma and his life like fuel in this kind of diversity machine. And this metaphor stuck with me. And amazingly, I think in some ways it feels even more relevant and powerful on the other side of the pandemic. And obviously that was not the context I was studying. And so I think to me, as someone who really struggles with sometimes how to make policy recommendations in a way that is thoughtful and while also seeds that I often just don't know, is to kind of work through those questions at conferences or in spaces where I present. I think hearing people, especially that NASPA one was great because the other person who was in my session canceled. And so it was just me. So I got a whole hour with a room of 40 people and an opportunity just to kind of talk through the framework and what people were seeing. And I really think one of the things that I've realized is that those policy recommendations, particularly coming out of ethnographic work, I have to kind of think through with other people. I can't just sit down and look at my data. And I mean, this is, I'll also say, and one of the things I try to teach my students is that negative critique in and of itself is good, right? Like, I think about all the stuff I teach with my students and they're like, they're just saying everything that's wrong. Like, why can't they offer solutions? Like a great example is we read this great study by Naliwe Rooks called Cutting Schools. It's about sort of white profit on Black education in Chicago. And I was like, well, I mean, if we like take Rooks at her word and maybe like we just like stop colonizing Black communities in Chicago and just let those communities make decisions for themselves, like we don't have to come up with policy recommendations. We actually want to empower other people to make those policy recommendations, right? And so I think I always want to come back to that, like negative critique and saying what not to do is still useful, right? But I will be completely honest. I completely struggle with how to make those policy recommendations.
Any final questions?
Before I forget to do this, I'm going to put my Dickinson email in the chat. That way, if anybody wants to reach out or ask questions later on, I have to do it.
We want to thank you so much, Kirk, for making time to be with us. We really appreciate it. You've dropped lots of gems as usual and given us quite a bit to think about. And it's wonderful to see all your success. We just glad to see all the good stuff that you continue, all the good work you continue to do in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming out of your lunch hour. And again, please reach out. I always want to center in these kinds of conversations that like, I have made plenty of mistakes along the way, in figuring these things out. And, I always want to, especially with my students, like sort of pull back the curtains and help them see that I feel like especially as a graduate student, you like idolize the people who get the jobs, and then you get the job, you idolize your colleagues who have tenure, and you just realize that like we're all still humans in the process, and that like I'm maybe on the other side of tenure, the like mysteries of the universe reveal themselves to you, but I don't get the sense that actually happens. And so, my hope more than anything is like to kind of demystify life on this side of graduate school. But again, like I'm just so grateful. Like I will forever be indebted to the EPS community and the students and staff and faculty and the people who were patient with me and challenged me and pushed me and encouraged me along the way. So it's a real joy to stay connected, and especially like friends in the chat. It's so good to see you. Seeing your faces, I'm like, I can't believe 5 years have passed.
Thanks so much, Kirk. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, you too.
Bye, everyone.